All right, y'all, we are gonna get started here. First off, thank you so much for joining us today for our virtual Ethics Club speaking event. My name is Jackson Stewart, and I wish I could be on camera right now, but I'm having some Wi-Fi issues, so we're gonna just go with my headshot right there. But I am the University of Utah Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative Student Ambassador, and will be graduating this May, which is definitely bittersweet, kind of a sad time to end my undergraduate experience, but all of my involvement at the U, especially with the Daniels Fund, has truly made it awesome. But we, again, just appreciate you taking the time to join us today. And I want to recognize a couple people, a part of the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative team here at the David Eccles School of Business. So first off, Dr. A. Baksheshi is the University of Utah Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative professor and director, and is a professor and lecturer of organizational behavior here at the U. The David Eccles School of Business. We have Candace Horn, who is the administrative manager for the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative. Also, a huge thank you to Michael Lewis, Jeff Nilsson, Coley Pine, and Sheena McFarland for being so helpful and supportive of the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative. And lastly, before I introduce our speaker, I just wanted to have a few items of business. So if you are here because your professor is offering you extra credit, you must attend the entire event, and we have an exit form at the end of the presentation that you will need to fill out on Zoom. So that will be how you achieve your extra credit. So look out for that at the end of the presentation. And again, that is the list of students who fill out that little form. That's who we're going to be submitting to your professors. So the registration at the beginning of the speaking event does not get you the extra credit. You have to fill out that form. And then we'll also have passport points towards the end for you business scholars that want to scan that QR code. So now to introduce our speaker, we have Elizabeth Rogers here, who is an integral member of the Michael Best's privacy and cybersecurity team. Elizabeth's work focuses on issues regarding breach responses, cybersecurity, privacy risk assessments, enterprise-wide cybersecurity frameworks across an entire array of industries, including retail, healthcare, financial services, state and local governments, and more. Outside of her law practice, she is also teaching cybersecurity and privacy law for the University of Texas. And I was first introduced to Elizabeth through my work at the Lassonde Entrepreneur Institute, where she's consulted with student startups. So that's another bullet on her resume, and she's been a very supportive person of the Daniels Fund, the mission that we have here. So I'm very excited to introduce her. And for you students that want to ask questions, please utilize the Q&A function on Zoom. That'll be like the last 15 minutes of Elizabeth's presentation. And then I will read your question, and then Elizabeth can answer as she sees fit. So without further ado, I'm going to give the screen to Elizabeth. Oh, Elizabeth, you're on mute right now.
Thank you. Sorry. Hello, everyone from Austin, Texas. It's so wonderful. I can join you virtually, although, it's difficult to travel now. These kinds of conference platforms allow us to be together. And I want to recognize all of you and applaud you for your being proactive and being involved in this club. On Saturday night, I had the honor of getting an award virtually. And so many of the people who attended virtually were people I met 42 years ago when I first started college. So I graduated 38 years ago, and we're still friends. And I know the friends that you've made through these kinds of activities will be with you the rest of your life. Before I get started, I just want to kind of set the stage for the framework that we're going to dive into. I was first in the private sector as a lawyer, starting in San Antonio, Texas, and moving with the same firm to Houston. But then I came to Austin in 1999 to serve the then Attorney General in a capacity as the employment law advisor. And it was right after the Enron scandal occurred in the early 2000s. And so in late 1990s, early 2000. And so he felt it important to appoint a chief ethics officer. So I became the first ever ethics officer for the Attorney General's office of Texas. And so it was a really amazing time. George Bush was running for president. There were so many scandals coming out of Enron. And all of us in the last 20 years, I think, have sharpened our view on how important ethics are, not only in business, but in government. And so when we talk today about the case studies that I'm going to present, what I'd like you to keep in mind is that these same fact patterns could apply in any industry. I just so happen to now be a privacy and technology and cybersecurity lawyer. And so my fact patterns are going to rise naturally in that context. But when you listen, be thinking for purposes of our discussion and your own questions, how would this apply, or what would I do if I know that something like this is happening in a banking context or a healthcare context, for example. And so because really the beauty of ethics is that although industries may evolve, we stay away from situational ethics. In other words, ethics don't change with the situation that you're in. Usually there are principles that drive the choices that people make. And so that's sort of the way I would like to tee it up and help you be thinking along the way. I'm going to share my screen now so that we can turn to the actual presentation and get started. Okay, so here is my contact information. After the presentation, I'll be sure to send this over to Jackson in case anybody would like to look at it in more depth, and I'm happy to answer questions. But what we're going to first do is we're going to focus today on something called ethical hacking, which is, like I said, it's particular to my industry currently, but again, you will find some of the concepts and fact patterns that we discuss applicable across industry. So let's begin by just discussing what is this ethical hacking as opposed to unethical or illegal hacking. Ethical hacking is actually an industry now, and you may have heard of tests like penetration testing, pen testing, and it's an industry where a company will be hired by another business to go in and legally break into the computers of the business to test devices, test the network, and see if the organization has enough defenses against the actual criminal hackers. And so the ethical hacker wears a white hat, and that white hat hacker is going in to try to find out if there are enough defenses against the black hat hackers. Today's presentation is going to involve a little bit of gray hat hackers, and I think you will know when we get to that moment. So basically, the company chooses to be hacked. They engage the ethical hacker to prepare a report. It is usually confidential, and in most cases involving a law firm. If a law firm is directing the company to do the hacking, it can be protected by the attorney-client privilege in the event there's ever any accusations made against the company for not doing the right things. So from a pen tester's point of view, there's no downside. The pen tester will win either way. What they've been hired to do is get past the current defenses, if there are enough. And if they do, then they provide this report and the business gets to close that hole before a black hat hacker discovers it, right? So that's one outcome. The other outcome is that the ethical hacker could find nothing. So that's a great report. The client's happy because now they can tell all their customers that we're secure enough that even a paid hacker couldn't break into us. So that's a very high overview of what ethical hacking is. And many of you may have heard of ethical hacking conferences. There are many renowned international computer security and hacking conferences. Some of the more popular ones are Black Hat, DEF CON, Hack in the Box, and the CCC. And they're unique because they bring together hackers and crackers that we call we call the crackers those who have actually done this in the past as a criminal background. They have a criminal background hacking, and they've reformed, and now they share their brilliance and their talent, so to speak, in a healthy, wholesome environment. There's also white hat security researchers and experts, as well as law enforcement and corporate and security penetration testing vendors. So these are people that have, let's say, a product that's supposed to protect a business, and they want to know, hey, is my product safe enough? Should we continue to market our product as keeping a network safe? And they want to find out at these conferences. So they have competitions, and let's say more than one vendor might allow the white hat hackers to earn money if they win. They also get a better reputation and future clients by identifying these vulnerabilities during the competition. So usually the winner at the end of the competition will accept a cash prize and then hand over how they exposed a vulnerability to the vendor. So if the vendor has been promising all of its customers, our firewall is 100% guaranteed, it will never fail. Well, if the hacker, the white hat hacker, has found a vulnerability in that firewall, then the vendor wants to know, how did the white hat hacker get through that particular software, right? So in this situation, there's no unauthorized access or use. So there's no threat of civil liability or criminal sanction unless they go beyond the scope of the competition or the conference. Okay, so this is important to know for our case studies, because before, about 10 years ago, many states had laws that forbid any kind of hacking. So even if you were a white hat hacker, you could not be hired by a business to help them figure out if their defenses were strong enough. So that pretty much sets the table for what we're going to talk about. Now, not all conference presentations where vulnerabilities are disclosed have a happy ending, especially when the vendor has not asked for the vulnerability to be discovered. Imagine going to a conference, you're one of these vendors who sell protection against a cybersecurity breach, and you find out that your company is being discussed at the conference because your product is vulnerable. So the most famous security vulnerability disclosure occurred at the 2005 Black Hat Conference in Las Vegas, where a man named Michael Lynn gave a controversial presentation on vulnerabilities found in a Cisco router. This incident by itself may be the best case study for examining ethical and legal issues surrounding vulnerability disclosure. So we're going to jump right in to the case study. Does anyone have any questions up to this point? Are we all good? If we do, Jackson, let me know.
Yeah, of course I will.
Okay, great. So here's how the Cisco vulnerability was disclosed. So many of you have heard of Cisco routers. And so because you do, it's probably because the fact is that Cisco supplies most of the internet's infrastructure on what it's called their routers, the Cisco router. So a router is a network device that forwards packets from one network to another and allows all of us to be connected off of the dark web to each other. And so over time, there have been security researchers who found flaws in Cisco's router, but typically they were minor and they were just maybe a denial of service attack, nothing major. However, Michael Lynn, who was a security researcher with a company at the time called Internet Security Systems, ISS, discovered what is believed to be the very first known vulnerability of buffer overflow against a Cisco router. That concept isn't significant for you to know for this purpose. Just know that it would allow an attacker to take over an entire network. And it's been described basically as a potential Pearl Harbor of vulnerability. So he found this vulnerability. ISS had already been in discussion with Cisco about this vulnerability. Cisco was notified that ISS, through Michael Lin, was going to present on the router vulnerability at the 2005 Black Hat conference. Cisco's response was, no way. We're going to sue you. We're going to sue your company. We're going to demand that the Black Hat organizers remove the presentation immediately from the conference. So at this point, just so you'll know, Cisco had neither fixed the vulnerability, though it was known, nor I notified their clients of this potentially serious Pearl Harbor vulnerability. No patch was available at the time. Instead of backing down, Lin just quit ISS. He told his boss, I'm gonna leave. I'm going to Black Hat. Anyway, I'm gonna tell them I'm gonna present on a different talk, which he did. But partway into his presentation, Lin begins to discuss the flaw in Cisco's router. Now I pause there because this is a current recurring theme in our case studies. There's a disclosure of a vulnerability. He had already been on notice that Cisco might sue him, might sue Black Hat, may even sue ISS, even though Lin was no longer employed. But you know, he stopped short of publishing his findings. He didn't publish the entire code that broke into the vulnerability. Or put that on the screen. He just included partial descriptions and tidbits of the code. However, this allowed a room full of hackers who go to these conferences to fully ascertain and share among themselves the shell code or the full code by the end of the presentation. So immediately, of course, Cisco followed through, filed lawsuits against Michael Lin, Black Hat, claiming an infringement of intellectual property, right? Because this is display of a code, which is intellectual property. So from a very high level, for those of you who don't know, there is a research exemption and a reverse engineering right under the fair use doctrine. So anytime something is copyrighted, and like if you're using, let's say, a song in a presentation, or you are conducting research or doing this, you know, for an educational purpose, it's exempt from infringement lawsuits. And there's a fair dealings doctrine outside of the US. But if there's publication over these boundaries of fair use and research, then there could be copyright sanctions. And furthermore, these copyright infringement lawsuits can be filed both against a person such as Lin, who publishes the copyrighted material, even including oral presentations, as well as the distributors, in this case, the conference organizer. So that was the lawsuit that Cisco filed against Lin and Black Hat. Ultimately, they were dropped against Black Hat and Lin on the condition that they refrain from future discussion about the vulnerability and the incident in general. So here's where we're going to pause and sort of reflect upon Lin's actions. Okay, so we know that he had discovered it. We know that they disclosed to Cisco that they planned to reveal the vulnerability at the conference. He backpedaled a little bit, but then because he felt compelled to reveal this vulnerability, he went ahead and disclosed it. Cisco backed down from a full-on lawsuit. And now here we are in our ethics discussion, the aspect that I'd like us to sort of focus on. So the code that Lin discovered that exploits any vulnerability, basically, but it's especially Cisco, right? Because it provides the infrastructure for the internet, often has a substantial market value. So the fact that he developed a code that could get in was worth a lot. And so back then, even in 2005, experts estimated that he could have sold it to Cisco at a market value of $250,000. So generally, the people who do break into the vulnerabilities of a vendor, they don't disclose it at a conference. They'd rather get paid for the code, right? Lynn decided he just didn't want to do that. He wanted to present this highly important and dangerous vulnerability due to inaction on the part of Cisco. And some might even classify it as a gross lack of action on Cisco's part to fix this vulnerability once they had been notified. Lynn had notified them on several occasions of the vulnerability and had been urging Cisco to fix the problem. And months passed and there was still no action. And this is months, and multiple thousands of customers were relying on Cisco. At this point, Lynn sought to expose the vulnerability to encourage better security practices instead of collecting $250,000 from Cisco. So this is one of the case studies that we're going to reflect upon. It really is going to make a lot more difference to you after I quickly go through the fact pattern of the next one, the LabMD case study. But just keep in mind the reasons, the intentions that Lynn had when he disclosed this vulnerability, and what could he have done something different? Should he have done something different? Did he make the right choice? And I think that will maybe be easier to decide once you hear about the LabMD fact pattern. So the LabMD fact pattern arose around the same time frame. I think we have maybe one question. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah, I can read out the question. So this person's just asking, did Cisco fix the vulnerability?
Yes, ultimately Cisco did, and had enough pressure from there on out. It had more scrutiny than ever after this came to the surface to create patches as soon as vulnerabilities were discovered instead of waiting months. So it did have a positive impact ultimately that Lynn disclosed it. Okay, this next fact pattern actually made the LabMD case was ultimately just decided in 2018. So this is a fact pattern that started in 2005 and was in litigation for 13 years. It's a very interesting lawsuit. For those of you who are interested in privacy and cybersecurity, it made a huge difference in the law from the Federal Trade Commission standpoint. But the facts underlying it are what I believe tells an even more valuable story in the ethics context. So back in 2005, when many of you guys may have been, in kindergarten or pre-K4, there used to be peer-to-peer file sharing of music that really sort of caused a big hit in the music industry. LimeWire was one of the big ones. And it was installed against company policy on one of the computers owned by somebody who worked at LabMD. LabMD was a company that tested for cancer, various cancers. And so they had a lot of health related information, or in legal terms, personal health information, or PHI. So all their data was regulated by HIPAA and the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Labor. So what happened was this employee had designated the contents of a folder called My Document for sharing, and really he was sharing music, peer-to-peer sharing of music. And in doing so, he exposed a file in that folder containing the healthcare information of 93,000 patients who went to LabMD for a cancer test. So years later, in February of 2008, there was a computer security company. And you may you may decide, okay, as you listen to Miss Rogers or Elizabeth talk about this, is this computer security company a white hat hacker, a gray hat hacker, or a black hat hacker? Because what ends up happening paints a much different picture than the Cisco case study. What happens is Tyversa, the security company, downloaded that file. They searched the internet. The CEO of this company named Robert Babak, had learned how to get into these peer-to-peer networks that were all separate, and he could block things and look inside of them on the dark web. And he downloaded that file and used that healthcare information that was in that file to pitch his services to LabMD. So here is, Robert Bobak and his team. They were instructed to find whatever kind of vulnerabilities they could, download the vulnerability, and then go to the actual owner of the business that had the vulnerability and say, hey, we found this vulnerability in your network. We would love to fix it for you. And so not just once, but more than once, Tyversa called LabMD. LabMD said, thank you so much for being a good Samaritan and pointing that out to us. We had no idea. We're fixing it. We're changing our practices. Well, when LabMD refused the last time, what Tyversa would do with all the people that it had researched for, and found vulnerabilities for, is to notify the Federal Trade Commission. And also, in this case, they notified a college professor who used this information as part of a publication on data security in the healthcare industry. So now all of a sudden, overnight, LabMD is famous in an article, but also becomes the subject of an investigation by the FTC for violating the privacy of the cancer patients and the patients who are getting cancer tests. So this is a different way of using the kind of same information that Michael Lynn found, right? I mean, both of them found vulnerabilities that exposed a business because it created privacy exposure, it created information security exposure that could result in a lot more damage. So here we have this person doing these things as his business. This was his entire business model. And just if you really are interested, I suspect someday this may be a movie because it's just got so many years of interesting twists and turns. But the owner of Tyversa used to be someone who would sell used cars on eBay, or that he would get from a police auction after they had been like confiscated by the police, and had another very minor job that he did. He had no direction. I think, he became a chiropractor, and because he didn't get to do his dream job of being a commercial pilot. So he came from this real humble background and discovered how to use the computer to find all of these vulnerabilities. And here we are with LabMD. So LabMD on the side, not really relevant to our conversation, gets sued by the FTC. There's enforcement action. So they tried to fight the FTC and say, you don't have authority to regulate us. And that's a whole nother story. It ended up shutting LabMD down. And then there's the story of Tyversa. What happens to Tyversa? Ultimately, what happened was the FBI raided the headquarters of this cyber intelligence firm, Tyversa, following years of allegations that it was extorting companies into buying its services. And it also got accused of falsified evidence of hacking. This was from the Reuters magazine. They finally put this guy, Robert Bobak, on leave, ending his dream to become a multimillionaire. But it just continued this pattern of getting information from companies, claiming that it acquired sensitive information that would cause serious harm either to people or to the government. And it got stopped and halted when one time it finally said that it found blueprints of a Marine One helicopter that was leaked through one of these peer-to-peer networks, and alleged that the users in Iran had downloaded them. So in other words, he was claiming that someone had put classified information into a peer-to-peer network, and that one of our enemies, or a company that shouldn't have, a foreign nation who was not entitled to them, had downloaded them. So this came to the attention of a House Oversight and Government Reform Committee that threw that claim into doubt, and they began an investigation, a serious investigation in 2015 of Tyversa. And what ended up happening was a former employee was fired, filed a whistleblower lawsuit against Tyversa. The Tyversa filed a defamation lawsuit against that former employee. And then during this House committee investigation, Wallace, the guy who had filed a whistleblower lawsuit, got immunity and told the House committee that the CEO had ordered him to falsify records showing that the patient data held by LabMD was leaked onto the peer-to-peer networks. And so that, in fact, never happen. It was never leaked into the network. It stayed in that folder that the employee had. And because of this lie, what ended up happening is that LabMD no longer exists because of the FTC investigation. But then what happens to Tyversa is even graver. Here's a picture of the FBI raiding the extortionist security business Tyversa. You can see all the cars. If you ever want to know what it looks like to be raided by the FBI, there's all the black cars on the street. Furthermore, it just became a huge train wreck, right? I mean, it's a great case for studying the law, but even more importantly, it points us toward today's presentation, toward a more ethical hacking framework. And this is where I'd like to have as much interaction as possible. I know we're on Zoom. I know we have to rely on chat, but when you consider the difference, now that you know both case studies, one is Michael Lynn disgusted, that Cisco has this technology product that provides multiple benefits around the world, has got a huge risk. So the benefits are incredible, but now there's risks that weigh as much, if not more, and they're doing nothing about it. What is the ethical duty of a business owner when they have a product that provides numerous benefits, whether it's a drug, or a cybersecurity defense solution, when they know the benefits are outweighed by the risks? What is the ethical duty on the company side? And then what is the ethical duty, if any, on the part of a stranger to the company who becomes aware of those risks? Instead of, like in Michael Lynn's case, instead of selling this information to the company, he took one course. He told a huge conference of people that could do something about it. Then on the other hand, we have this cybersecurity company owned by Robert Bobak, Tyversa, who does have a technology tool that can do a lot, provide a lot of benefits. It can help companies like my law firm, or a school, to discover vulnerabilities. What is that duty? Or when you have a company that offers so many benefits, do you use that as a weapon? Is there an ethical duty to make choices along the lines of what's better for the common good versus using your own gifts to exploit another organization? And how do we govern people in these very powerful positions who basically have control in the information age over all the networks that we rely on just to do everyday business? So with that question, And with I know we have more than 15 minutes left for questions and answers. I still want to involve some of you that want to participate, because I'd like us to figure out what can we do, what would you have done, if anything, differently than Michael Lynn, or what would you have done if you were Cisco? And then finally, in the Tyversa LabMD, what are your thoughts, and what are ways that Robert Bobak might have made different choices from an ethical standpoint? And if we don't have any questions right now, I do have a framework for us to talk through. I just wanted to pause in case anybody wanted to jump, raise your hand and jump into the conversation.
So there's actually one question right now that kind of goes in line with what you're asking here. And this person asks, what were the repercussions of Cisco waiting and not wanting to release their knowledge of the defect? And I think that kind of your answer there might spur up some more thoughts from students.
Mm-hmm.
And
So,
then where students can mute themselves here. It's just going to be on chat. So
okay. Okay, great. So the consequences at the time in 2005, and even today, 16 years later, there are no legal consequences. There are not, and that's something that lawmakers are being asked to regulate. So I want to definitely bookmark that. But until there are like incentives from lawmakers, like in other words, penalties or fines, or um, some kind of regulatory framework around what companies should be doing for their own products, the only consequence is a loss of reputation, a loss of trust among customers. So, it's one thing if you're the only game in town, what is that really going to be a consequence if you're the only company that provides all the network infrastructure? Probably not, right? And so that's your question is great, because that's why there's so much attention right now on the Hill and in Europe, in fact, on the big tech giants who have so much control over not only our data, but just social media in general. Like what can we do, and what step will be strong enough to regulate their their vulnerabilities, right? There's so many benefits from all of the companies that we've been talking about, but how can we put some barriers and boundaries on the evil things that can happen with that technology, right? So far there's not, but I can last fall was the last time I saw something get passed before the former president left, and it was the Cybersecurity and Internet of Things Act. And currently, it was a step in the right direction, where lawmakers meet the private sector or the public sector to try to put some of these consequences in place for unethical or irresponsible behavior. And it's in the context of the Internet of Things. So right now, it's only limited. That act was signed to only apply to agencies. So any agency, federal government agency that uses smart devices to measure, let's say, electric usage, or any kind of consumer usage of a product, has to put into place adequate security into the software. And if they don't, they get banned from any federal government contracting. So while it's not right now impacting you and me in the private sector, it will eventually, hopefully, have move into the private sector, so that any kind of smart device, or in this case, failure to patch a vulnerability, could result in serious consequences.
excellent. And this person has a follow-up question. And I think this applies to Cisco and, just like you mentioned, some of the technology giants that are around right now. But the question is, do you find that companies who monopolize industries find it easier to be less ethical in decisions like this?
Absolutely. And so, without meaning to indict the entire high tech or large company, platforms, I do believe, and it's the case with so much of our technology, right? Is that even in the last year, there have been so many technology solutions to help us try to stay connected, right? Starting with Zoom, which in, last March, almost a year ago, the New York Attorney General shut Zoom down in New York because of the Zoom vulnerabilities. The technology is going out there to try to solve our problems in the world, which is a great thing. And we want innovation, and we don't want all these fines and regulatory fees, to halt innovation. We want to promote that, but we also want to promote ethical and responsible design in the security. So what does it take right now? Because people are not vetting the security and the privacy considerations as much as they should, they come out with a solution. They go to a campus or they go to a business and say, here, look at all the benefits for providing you. And we as business owners have a duty to say, time out. Thank you for telling us about the benefits. What are the risks? Have you tested the security design of this product that you're trying to sell us? So we as business owners going out into the business world, like you will be, and if you're going to be one of the designers of these technologies, we've got to be able to stop and pause and not rush to market without considering the ethical duties we have to make them safe and to use them safely. Until there are regulations, however, and until it becomes a culture internally, I think there are going to be fewer barriers to temptation to just rush, and maybe not in a mean-spirited way or a criminals, way. They're just going to rush to make money without thinking of what could have been done, to prevent harm.
Excellent. And I guess a follow-up to that, a person asked, how common is it for companies to not share these vulnerabilities? And then a question I would have is like, how often do you find that it's, intentional that they, know of it and then don't share? And then how much of it is, just ignorance, kind of what you just touched on. It's like, they're just trying to rush, a product to market or whatever it may be to make some money.
Yeah, so it's becoming less and less common, and I can tell you that it's mainly because the federal government has taken a huge step toward becoming involved in trying to prevent it. And the Equifax breach is an excellent example of people trying to do the right thing. And so there was a warning that went out when the Equifax breach, around the time the Equifax breach occurred. Again, it was in March, and I can't remember the year exactly, but it went out to everybody who had Java. It was a JavaScript vulnerability, and it was this vulnerability was issued by US CERT, and that's a federal government agency that's computer emergency response team. So it's called US Computer Emergency Response Team. And they sent out a notice to everyone who had Java saying you've got to patch this vulnerability immediately. So most everyone did, including Equifax, but they had 800 information security technicians and analysts and professionals who couldn't prevent the breach, who didn't fix it right. So it was ignorance, Jackson, to your point. What happened was all the systems that housed all of our social security numbers and credit information at Equifax was in various places. So there was old information that was on a legacy system. And so the scanner that tried to scan for the JavaScript vulnerability wouldn't work on that particular legacy system. So that's where about 150 million of records were just completely overlooked when they did the scan for the JavaScript vulnerability. And they didn't follow up to test it, to see if the scan they did to look for the patch was effective. And so there were steps that, we're still maturing in this information age. Again, the technology sometimes gets out ahead of the law, number one, but it also gets out ahead of very basic steps that could be taken to enhance the security and the privacy of the solution. And we're all learning from major mistakes like this, and so are the lawmakers. And so we're just hoping that the industries can regulate themselves before it gets to a point where all of you who are either, want to own your own business or or work in leadership at a big business, you know, we don't want to stifle innovation by the cost of all these regulations. So hopefully people will start self-regulating a lot better.
Excellent. I love that. And this question kind of goes along with your statement. And this person's wondering how forthcoming, how forthcoming are companies, especially startups, with risks in these situations? And you kind of touched on Zoom, but do you see, I guess, like a change in that culture?
Yes, yes, gratefully, yes. And unfortunately, it's again through trial and error and making mistakes. Like I can give you an example of a client we had that made a beautiful product. It was a technological innovation involving a heartbeat monitor reading device that the mother to be could wear while pregnant, and it recorded the baby's heartbeat, and the baby's heartbeat could be sent to relatives and friends. And it was just a beautiful product, you know, to share with the new, you know, baby's heart on the way. But what they failed to share and disclose to um, the purchasers of the product in their privacy policies, they were recording, you know, but anytime the baby's heartbeat was recording, then it was being hosted by the maker of the heartbeat monitor recorder, or heartbeat recorder, sorry, and being sold to either improve the product or for other purposes related to babies' heartbeats. And so that was a huge violation of privacy. The makers of the product didn't mean intentionally not to follow the law. But again, as we become a culture who's more um, focused on privacy, and you know, we may not ever get to the European level of considering privacy part of, you know, a fundamental human right, but we're becoming more toward that way, and especially younger junior startups who really don't want to lose a lot of money, you know, that they get from their investors by accidentally violating, you know, a very basic um, principle of privacy or security. And so, on the other hand, sadly, I've been to a lot of tech law conferences. One I went to was in Duke a couple of years ago, and the young people there who were startup, uh, business students said, "I'm just going to stay out of California. If I have to comply with the California Consumer Privacy Act, then it's going to be all these, you know, class action lawsuits against me." So there is that option of staying away from jurisdictions who are really, you know, like Europe and California, that are really harsh as far as requirements. But what I try to do is help clients achieve the strictest standard at the lowest cost so that wherever they do business, they're going to have some basic compliance in their security and in their privacy compliance program.
Awesome. And there's no more outstanding questions, but
Okay.
I know you mentioned a framework.
Yes,
Uh,
let's talk about slide
Perfect.
19. So just some thoughts about both of the hackers in this case. We had Michael Lynn, who was a hacker, and if we had to take a vote on how many thought he was a white hat, a gray hat, or a black hat, I'm just curious how many think he was a gray or white hat. I don't have to see the answer, but these are the kinds of questions I'm kind of diving into for the rest of our presentation. And then the same question would go with Robert Bobak, who owned Tyversa. What would you consider him to be? You know, white hat, gray hat, black hat? And how do you prevent this kind of ethical dilemma that, you know, and how do you guide your team, you know, your business leadership toward preventing the catastrophe that occurred in Tyversa or the catastrophe that occurred at Cisco, right? And my thoughts are these, and it's the reason I said it could apply to any industry and any business team, that it has to be more than outcome oriented. So in other words, let's say you want to test your business, whether it's an audit in your accounting, right? That's one of the Enron lessons, whether it's an audit of your cybersecurity defenses, you want to hire somebody who can tell you whether or not you're okay. And you've got a bunch of customers you want to protect. So you're really doing this for the right reason. Um, and you do an RFP and you come back, you get about 15 different responses. We have to look more to hiring someone based on just the preferred qualifications. And what do I mean by that? When I'm talking about ethics in hiring and in the culture, um, we have to look beyond the resume and we have to look beyond the checklist that they tell us they're going to use to perform the job. Yes, they may be technically superior, and their checklist may be incredibly comprehensive and they're providing us the best cost for a very comprehensive job by someone who's very qualified. But is that really all that matters when we have to think about the soft and intangible metrics of our company's success? When we're thinking about the culture of ethics, and the answer is no, it has to be more. And so I just encourage your team, your class, your colleagues to think about what kind of diligence are we going to need going forward with the ability to gain access to so much information about our competitors. What do we do with that? What do we do when we're hiring somebody to look at the most sensitive information and assets of the entire company, which currently in the information age is what? Data, right? So whether it's health data or intellectual property. And so you're going to want to look at the 360 view of the person you're giving access to your company, whether it's somebody you're hiring permanently or someone who's just going to be a contractor. And you want to do a thorough background check on their history and the intentions, right? Because when you look at Michael Lynn and Robert Bobak, you couldn't contrast there couldn't be more of a contrast between their intentions, right? One could have gotten $250,000 for what he discovered and disclosed, and the other one, and he walked away from the money. And the other one, all he did was operate a business on the model of exploitation, of getting someone else's money for what he discovered. So the intentions and the looking into the heart and not just the brain of the people we're hiring is becoming more and more of a challenge, right? Because so many people are automating their recruiting. They're trying to be the most efficient at doing things like that. So I just remind everybody to, when you graduate with the idea that we're going to have to consider the entire human when we build our team and operate our business. And then there's the legal side that it's not as difficult as it might seem, but there are ways to create barriers between opportunity and temptation. And really that was if you've ever read the story about the downfall of Enron, there weren't any barriers between temptation and opportunity. And even the best of us, the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts or whomever, with a background, unfortunately, yielded to the temptation. So that's one of the other lessons, is to create those barriers between temptation and opportunity and use contract clauses to shift, have the contractor acknowledge and the consequences for failing to act ethically and create liability for beyond monetary liability. And then finally, make sure that the non-disclosure agreement that you have anybody sign is ironclad, and that they're not allowed to share any information that they discover when they're doing an audit with anybody, especially your customers. And with that, I think there's still a few minutes left for some questions that may have arisen.
Yeah, so this person is asking, if companies are continually ahead of the law, how do lawmakers start deciding how to create a new law without a precedent and a stare decisis?
Well, the good news is that at least one lawmaking body that I'm aware of, the FTC, does a really good job of having public hearings and issuing a new regulation for public comment. So they'll give the public like I'm working right now with FERC, which is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They just issued a cybersecurity initiative, providing incentives to electric utility companies who are going to do more to make the grid more than the law currently requires. So I'm letting everybody know that's in that industry, hey, if you want to add, tell the regulators now. They're giving you a chance for your input, and tell them whether it's going too far or whether or not they're not going far enough. So the good news is that the lawmakers recognize their own limitations on expertise. They know the people in the industry are the best source for helping them. Just like judges hardly understand technology sometimes, so they get law clerks and consultants to help them fill in the gaps of their knowledge. And so I've been proud to see, at least in the United States, that our government lawmakers are at least making an attempt to involve the people they're about to regulate.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. We can do I'm not sure if you have a closing slide. If not, then we can just kind of sign off now.
I do not. I have our offices, and I have a question.
Lovely.
Yeah, sorry, I don't. I wish I had a happy ending to,
No, it's okay.
but I'm definitely, this won't be the last time we talk, unless, if you guys want further conversation and resources about these issues, I'm happy to support you. And thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for speaking about this. I think it's, left a lot of us, with kind of lingering thoughts in our mind about the companies that we work for, and kind of gives us a better perspective of what we, read in the news, especially as, this is kind of an often occurrence. So thank you so much. And again, for all of you students that are here, thank you for attending, and for all of your questions. I think a lot of those were fantastic questions. And lastly, if you are here for extra credit or passport points, please see the, I guess, survey that's going to pop up. But I guess a virtual round of applause for Elizabeth. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you. I'm really glad to be a part. I will talk with you later, Jackson, and let me know. I'll send you the slides, and if y'all have any follow-up questions after, I'm happy to answer those too.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Elizabeth.
You're welcome. Bye, everyone.
See ya.